Fantastic. Oh, it's really great to see you. You've made my day. I'm just going to record this.
Are you going to record it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that? Yeah.
Okay. Just a brief introduction. My name's Clive. I came down on 15th of October to St Paul's at 10 o'clock at night. And I came down for three reasons. First reason was I was on the Gaza March where they kettled everybody under the underpass and started beating people up. So I came to see for myself what was happening because none of that was televised on the mainstream media. And I was pleasantly surprised that although the occupiers were massively outnumbered by the police, the occupation went unhindered. The second reason was that for about 10 years I've been looking at the way the world has been developing, and in particular the banking system, and getting more and more depressed because I couldn't see a way out. I couldn't see the way it was going to get better. But prompted by what happened in Wall Street on the 17th of September and reinforced by the occupation of St Paul's on the 15th of October, I felt a real sense of optimism, and that made me want to come down and join Occupy. The third reason is because I have been looking at the way the world works, and I work in the city, and from my analysis, the root cause of most of the problems that Occupy is about is actually our banking and monetary system. And I was asked to come down, I volunteered to come down here tonight to do two things. One, to give you a very brief history of Goldman Sachs, according to Matt Taibbi, and also to give you a brief introduction to why I think the banking and monetary system lies at the root of our problems. Okay, how many of you have read Matt Taibbi's article, The Great American Bubble Machine? Okay, in that case you won't know whether I'm telling you what he wrote or not. I would urge you to read it. It was published in Rolling Stone on in July 2009, so a couple of years, 3 years ago now. But it is a seminal analysis of Goldman Sachs over the last 100 years. And I'm going to give you a very quick canter through, according to Matt Taibbi, but there is no way I can do his work justice. Because if it was fiction, it would be very funny. He writes very well, but sadly it's not fiction. Anyway, Goldman Sachs was formed in 1869 by Marcus Goldman and his son-in-law, Sachs, Samuel Sachs. And they pioneered the use of commercial paper lending to small businesses. And it was a plucky immigrant business, an emerging business in amongst a lot of established banks, and it did rather well. If we fast forward to the 1920s, everybody wanted to get into the stock market, and one of the means of getting into the stock market was something called investment trusts. And investment trusts gave the ordinary guy in the street the opportunity to put money into a pool that would buy stocks and shares, and they could feel like they were a shareholder. Goldman Sachs came in late into this game, but they came in spades. And they set up something called the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation. They came in with their boots on, heavy boots. They came in large. They came in late but large. Sorry, I use colloquialism. Please pick me up. And they launched this global Goldman Sachs Global Trading Corporation. And they bought the shares themselves and then sold them on to the punters at a profit. And then they started buying shares in the trust on leveraged funds, and they were just ramping up the price. They then launched the second fund called the Shenandoah Corporation, and they used that to buy shares in the first investment trust. And then they launched another one called Blue Ridge Corporation, and that bought shares accordingly. So all of these trusts were ramping up the shares in each other, and they drove the price right up, and of course they got out before the market collapsed. So that was their first transgression, if you like. They lost something in the order, in today's money, of £475 million, dollars rather, but they survived. And following the crash of 29, the Glass-Steagall Act and various other regulatory rules kept the banks reasonably clean for a long time. And when I came into the city, Goldman Sachs was considered to be one of the prestige houses. If you were a Goldman Sachs banker, you were considered to be creme de la creme, in spite of the fact that they were fairly late into the city. So they developed this reputation, so much so that Robert Rubin, who is the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, was appointed Clinton's Treasury Secretary in the 90s. And he, Greenspan and Larry Summers, who was more of an academic economist, basically ruled the world. If we come to 2000, and this is where I have some experience of what went on. I obviously wasn't around in the 1920s build-up, but I was around when this happened. And this was the dot-com boom. The dot-com boom was basically packaging internet companies and selling them onto the stock market. When you floated companies on the stock market, historically, they had to prove that they had 3 years of accounts showing steady profit increase, and then they were brought to the market. In the internet bubble, all that changed. Anybody who had half an idea that the bankers thought they could get away with, didn't matter whether you were going to lose masses of money. There was something called the burn rate, which is the amount of money was raised, the rate at which you burnt through it. And Goldman Sachs were one of the preeminent practitioners of IPOs in the dot-com boom. They floated Yahoo in 1996, and they went on to float a whole load of companies, including Webvan and others that actually went bankrupt, and they ended up being sued. And they didn't just bring them to the market, but they would actually manipulate the price to make the prices keep going up. I'm just going to grab some water. They used techniques such as laddering, and they also provided preferential rates to the executives of the companies.
What's laddering?
I hoped you weren't going to ask me that,
sorry.
but basically, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's quite technical, but basically it's a means of ramping up the price to investors. So we go on to the next bubble, if you like, that Goldman's made money out of, and that was housing. Are you all familiar with the subprime crisis? Because after all, that's what brought us here today. Well, I won't do it in detail, but basically it was the idea of taking mortgages and turning them into securities. So you take 100 mortgages, you wrap them up in a security, and you sell them on the market. And that was an okay idea, I suppose, in a manner of speaking. But one of the things that I'm going to talk about later is the need to continually increase the amount of debt. And once you've lent money to all the people who could afford houses, you had to create mortgages to those who couldn't afford houses. And that was what the subprime crisis was all about. Basically, they were giving mortgages to people who were never going to be able to make the repayments. The repayments would start artificially low, and then sooner or later, the payments would rise. But by that time, everybody had made their money and got out. And so from the year 2000 to year 2006, there was this huge run-up in mortgage-backed securities. And they were sold to banks, pension funds, investors. And the reason they managed to sell them to institutional investors like pension funds is they got AAA ratings. And the way they got AAA ratings was by working with the credit rating agencies, who would actually give them the ratings. And if you're beginning to get the idea that the whole of the securities market is a bit of a casino, you're right. So we then move on. So the subprime crisis, incidentally, the mortgages started to not be repaid, so the securities started dropping in value, and the whole thing was falling off the cliff. And I'll come on to what happened next in a minute. In the meantime, Goldman's found another way of making money. which is by speculating in oil futures. Now, historically, the reason that we have commodities markets is to smooth the price of commodities for producers, principally farmers originally, so it would enable farmers to sell their crop in advance so they could buy fertilizer and pay their wages and all the rest of it. And there was a rule in the commodities market that no speculators could invest more than physical producers. But under Robert Rubin, remember the ex-Goldman man who worked with Clinton, that rule was abolished. So it was a free-for-all in the commodities markets. And that was the other market that Goldman played, ran up the oil price. It went from in the $70 a barrel up to $147 a barrel and then crashed again. And they made money out of that. Now remember the subprime crisis, that everybody was losing money and the banks needed bailing out. Now there were two bailouts. There were many bailouts, but there were two major bailouts that people might have noticed. One was called the Troubled Assets Recovery Program, and the other one was the AIG bailout. Rubin had gone. He was now head of Citibank, so he moved on from Treasury Secretary. The new Treasury Secretary under Bush was a man named Hank Paulson. He was a former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and he put together the $800 billion bailout program for the banks, of which Goldman Sachs got a substantial slice. And it gets better, because a lot of these securities were insured with an insurance company called AIG. And basically the banks, knowing that they might lose money on these mortgages that weren't worth a great deal, even though they were selling them to their clients, they actually managed to insure them with AIG. AIG wrote these policies out of a unit in London. And of course, when the banks went to claim all this money from the policies because their loans had gone bad, the securities had gone bad, AIG had no money in their pockets, none at all. There was a secret meeting in September 2008 attended by Hank Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Treasury Secretary to George Bush, and Lloyd Blankfein, the then current CEO of Goldman Sachs. And they got in a room with a bunch of other people and agreed $128 billion bailout to AIG. Also, Goldman Sachs could get $13 billion of that back into their accounts. In the following quarter, in the first quarter of 2009, the executives paid themselves bonuses of some $4.5 billion. So that was scam number 4, I think. How are we doing? Next scam was carbon trading. Carbon trading was set up under the auspices of something called the Chicago Climate Change Exchange, which also owns the European Climate Exchange. Goldman Sachs it's now been sold, but owned 10% of the Chicago Climate Exchange, which in turn owned the European Climate Exchange. Al Gore set up a company called Generation Wealth Management with a few ex-Goldman Sachs people, and they had 2.3 of the Chicago Climate Exchange. Now, there's been a bit of history under the water which Taby doesn't report, which is basically that this was all premised on cap and trade being introduced into legislation in the States. And cap and trade meant that all industrial businesses would get a certain carbon allowance and then they could trade the rest. So Goldman's were hoping to get big in this. In 2008, the turnover in the carbon trading business, carbon trading was worth $140 billion. And that was before cap and trade. Had cap and trade come along, it would have gone into the trillions. Well, what happened is cap and trade went away, and Chicago, there is no more trading of carbon. It is only continuing in Europe, where there are artificial rules and regulations to keep it going. Climate change debt. In June last year, climate change debt to small countries like Bangladesh, Caribbean islands totaled $1.1 billion. Now, I don't have a current figure as to what it's reached, but I've been watching them through the months following, and hundreds of billions are going to these countries for climate change, so-called remediation. The problem is all that debt goes, the benefits of that debt goes to the elites that run those countries, and the populations are saddled with the debt in perpetuity. So that's really a brief roundup of Goldman Sachs. I would urge you to read the Rolling Stone article. It's available online.
Can you repeat the name of the article?
The Great American Bubble Machine. Matt Taibbi described Goldman Sachs as a great vampire squid clasped over the face of humanity, with its blood-sucking funnel into everything that smells of money. And that gives you an idea of the flavour of his article. But anyway, Goldman Sachs is one bank, and it's by no means the only bank that got up to all these problems. No means alone. I talked a bit about Citibank. Robert Rubin went to head up Citibank. JP Morgan Chase, Barclays. There are other banks involved. So, Goldman is one, but it's not the only one. So I wanted to talk a bit about banks in general. And before doing that, I think it's worth just touching on where Goldman Sachs is now in terms of its political control. Now, I don't know how many of you watched the Greek debt crisis unfold, but in 2003, Goldman Sachs put together a debt swap deal for $2.8 billion. And what this allowed with the Greeks, and what this allowed the Greeks to do was to take $2.8 billion worth of debt off their books and hide it. Why would they want to do this? Because to qualify for the euro currency, they had to demonstrate a downward trajectory of their deficit and debt. So by hiding the debt, they got into the euro. Now, you may have noticed that Greece is no longer a democracy. The people who put together the deal with Goldman Sachs to get Greece into the euro are now running Greece. It's an unelected technocratic government, closely related to Goldman Sachs. Who runs Italy? Sorry? Mario Monti. Was Mario Monti elected? No. Was Mario Monti an advisor to Goldman Sachs International? Yes, he was. And if you look in the European Union, let's take the European Central Bank, which is in the business of bailing out Greece, Spain, and all the other European banks. Mario Draghi, he was a former managing director of Goldman Sachs International. And if you look, there's an article in The Independent which actually maps out all the individuals in politics who are former Goldman Sachs alumni. And although Paulson is no longer in the Treasury, there is a new team in town from Goldman Sachs. And one of the reasons that I have this concern about banks being at the root of our problems is that they control the politics. And this goes way back in history. In 1694, the Bank of England was established. It was a privately owned bank, owned by private banking interests. And that gave it the power to issue money. And that is important because, as Amschel Rothschild said in 1838, "Let me issue and control a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." And by virtue of what we've seen with Goldman Sachs, we know this to be true. So I'm going to give you a brief roundup. We live in a dollarized world. We live in the age of American empire. And it's very easy to get hung up on the British political scene and think that it's going to make any difference in the world. It's not. The world is dollarized at the moment. maybe not for long. China could possibly take over reserve status, but I won't go there at the moment. So let's look at the world from a dollar perspective. So although the Bank of England was established in 1694, what is interesting to look at is the development of banking in America, because that's where the world is run from these days. That's where all the multinationals are run from. The American War of Independence was fought over the colonies issuing their own money, which meant that King George III didn't get his tax receipts, and it meant European bankers didn't get their hands on what was the best emerging economy of its day. And so the American War of Independence was fought, and with the support of the French and for various other reasons, the American nation was born. Now, the Founding Fathers wanted to protect the American people from bankers. They just managed to escape from the yoke of the Bank of England and King George. They didn't want another load of bankers taking over the new nascent American state. Nonetheless, in 1791, not long after the War of Independence was won in 1782, the first central bank of America was formed. It was given a 20-year charter. It didn't prove to be very popular, and it was privately owned, let me add. It was a privately owned central bank, and its charter wasn't renewed. But the banks were not to be kept out for long, and by using political influence, also known as bribery and corruption, they managed to get a second central bank in 1816. And the second central bank coincided with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, I think. Now, Jackson described the central bank as an engine of corruption. He was vehemently against central banks because he'd seen the power of what they could do, but with control of the money supply. Needless to say, Jackson was a very successful president, and when the charter ran out, then the bank was no more. He kept the central banks at bay until 1913, when the banks created an artificial boom and bust, similar to 1929, which created the appetite. They said, what you need is a central bank. And the Federal Reserve Act was passed in December 1913, when very few people were in the House, and there were sufficient policemen who were paid by the bankers to get the act through. And that led to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And to this day, contrary to everybody's belief, including many of the people who work in the square mile, the Federal Reserve is a privately owned institution. There are 12 Federal Reserve banks. Each of them are privately owned. So when people say to you, the Fed is run by the government, nonsense. The government has the ability to appoint the chairman of the Federal Reserve, currently Ben Bernanke, preceded by Alan Greenspan, but they do not control the Federal Reserve. And whilst we're on the subject of control, I think I suggested earlier that the world is run from America. That's not strictly true. The world is run by fairly narrow banking interests, many of which originated in Europe, some of which got very wealthy in America. The Rockefellers, for example, are behind Citibank, as well as the World Wildlife Fund, incidentally. Rockefeller is behind the World Wildlife Fund. Okay, so we were talking about control. There was a scientific paper study, a scientific study that was published in the autumn of last year in the New Scientist, and it analysed 40,060 transnational corporations, multinationals. And by looking at publicly available information, so this is not looking at nominee companies or blind trust holdings or offshore holdings, but just looking at publicly available information, they found that those 40% of those 40,000 companies were controlled by just 147 what they described super entities. Now, my suspicion is, and I haven't had the time to go into it, that those 147 are actually even more narrowly held through offshore trusts, blind nominee holdings, etc. But even if you take that it's 147, how can it be sensible to have 40% of the world's economic activity controlled by just 147 interests? And I reckon it's less than that. Now, in the top 50, 45 of those top entities, 45 of the top 50 are actually financial stocks. And in the top 20, there are Barclays, JP Morgan, and our friends Goldman Sachs. So there is a great element of control exercised by banks. Eh? Well, I think there's a great temptation to personalize and have personal animosity to people who work in these banks. Now they joined a business they didn't really understand. I joined the city without understanding all this. All they're doing is reacting to incentives of the structure. So we're not attacking Goldman Sachs. We're attacking the structure that allows banks like Goldman Sachs to do what they do, because they can't help themselves. They're incentivized to hoover up as much wealth as possible at the expense of the rest of us. It's the way the system works, and that's what we have to attack. And it's this one simple concept. And I come back to why I came down on the 15th of October last year. And that is, if we could get the global Occupy movement to unite around the single objective of removing the power of banks to create money, we would solve so many other problems. I know we have many other issues, public sector cuts, all the things that were, again, bankers' bonuses. These are all a product of banks' ability to create money. If we took that away, those would disappear. Not overnight, but we would find the means to get rid of them. People talk regulation. The problem is the system incentivizes people to do exactly the wrong thing. No amount of regulation is going to stop them doing the wrong thing. Goldman Sachs behaved criminally throughout the subprime crisis. They've come to accommodation with the Securities and Exchange Committee, many of whom probably are ex-Goldman or ex-bankers, where they pay a gratuitous fine of $450 million, which is peanuts compared to the billions they made. And they've never accepted criminal liability. So this is about opening up the system and changing the whole way our money works. And I'm not going to go into a technical discussion on money creation. But my objective in joining Occupy was to get everybody I know to understand the power of the banks, and they get that power from creating money. And there is a book I would recommend to you all. Sorry? I wrote it, I mentioned it last night. It's The Web of Debt. It's written by a US attorney who knows the US markets inside and out. Her name is Ellen Brown, E-L-L-E-N Brown. And I would recommend it. It's quite readable. I guess I come from the world of finance, so I find it fairly easy to read. If you find that difficult, then watch a video, a 45-minute video called Money as Debt. And it'll give you a very good introduction to the sort of things I've been talking about. I mean, I could give you loads of other references, but I think I've said quite enough, and I'm happy to take questions.
I was curious. Like the point being that, like, you know, if the Occupy movement could centre on a specific objective, you'd support the idea of it removing the power of private banks to create money. So does that mean, like, you would endorse what the Positive Money campaign has been talking about? Like, or are they talking about different things?
Well, from all the work I've done, I don't know if you know this, but I'm also running a critical thinking course at the Free University. And one of the things we're looking at is, and this is not my work, this is the group's work, We're examining the way the banking system works and looking to create alternatives. And those ideas are germinating. But I think we need two things. We need to abolish fractional reserve banking, first and foremost, which allows the banks to create money from nothing. But I have a much more contentious proposal, which is now generally shared by the group I'm working with, because we've done the work working through the consequences of abolishing interest. Because the problem is, interest allows those with money to exploit those who need it. And I think, as well as taking away the power of banks to create money, if we want to create equal opportunity and reduce inequality in society, interest is one of the biggest drivers of inequality, and it's proven. And I can refer you to a paper by a lady called Margaret Kennedy. That's Margaret, M-A-R-G-R-I-T, she's German, Margaret Kennedy. She wrote a paper in 1995 called Interest and Inflation-Free Money. And in there she demonstrates, she demonstrates why interest is such a problem. And she's looking at data for Germany, which is much less unequal than either the UK and the US. And she found that the bottom 80% of the population paid more interest. They paid twice as much interest as they received. And everybody pays interest. You all pay interest. You buy a railway ticket, it's got interest in it. You buy food, there's interest in it. You pay rent, there's interest in it. So everybody pays interest. And in Germany, back in the 1990s, the bottom 80% paid twice as much as they received. The top 10% received all of the interest that the bottom 80% paid. How? Because those with the money get all the interest. The system migrates the wealth to the top 10%, and even to the top 1%, and the top 0.01% got 2,000 times the top 10%. So it's an exponential curve.
Just on that point, on their comments about interest, there's other systems globally that kind of the Islamic community.
Sharia finance.
Yeah, and what are your comments about that? And secondly, I know very humbly Clive does a lot of work with Free University and is brilliant. But how does the educational side of this movement and what we're doing, how does that tie into the way you occupy events?
I was at before I came to St Bride's last night. The reason I was late, I was at a reception of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investments, and this is, if you like, the trade body for a lot of people who work in the city. And I met a guy there who actually was from an Islamic bank, and we were talking about Sharia finance. The principle of Sharia finance is there is no interest. I mean, there are a lot of other things like alcohol and certain things that they won't invest in, but the principle is there is no interest. So if I have capital and Aaron has an idea that he wants investment for, we come to an agreement. I give him money and we share the profit. He's not going to pay me money unless he makes a profit. So capital and enterprise share the reward, whereas under an interest system, capital always gets a return irrespective of the profitability of enterprise. So that's why I believe interest is an important issue, and positive money don't actually get that money. They do a lot of good stuff, and I think the more people who educate people about the bank's power to create money, the better. But positive money also believe that they can achieve this change through the current political system. I don't think it's possible. I think we need a global Occupy movement to achieve this change, which is why, coming on to Aaron's second point, I'm spending my time doing these teach outs, talking to people in the Free University, writing articles. I gave this talk at the Securities Institute in February, and I was expecting to be hounded out of the building. Not the Goldman Sachs talk, by the way, the second bit. It was much more on money creation, and I was expecting not to get a very good reception. But I was quite surprised. There's quite a lot of people who work in the city who are beginning to wake up to the iniquities of the system within which they work. When I was at Occupy doing these talks, I would have people come up to me who were walking by who worked in the city. So there is a growing awareness, and we're all victims. You know, the people who work in this building are victims. Not all of them are on multi-million pound bonuses. You know, the secretaries, the people, these guys. Yeah, these guys, they're all victims of the system because they've got families. Their families are going to be affected by this because there is a debt tsunami on its way. Be there no doubt on that question. This is a giant Ponzi scheme. We have the ECB, which is bailing out Spain. The ECB is being funded by Greece to bail out Spain, and Italy to bail out Spain, and Spain to bail out Spain. You know, this is a pack of cards on a pack of cards. You take the card away from underneath, the whole thing's going to crash. The UK is 3 days from starvation because we import a lot of our food. If the economic system collapses, there will be bloody revolution on the streets. And what I'm trying to do is get people to understand the way money works before that happens, so we have an alternative in place. And there are a lot of alternatives coming up. There are local currency systems. In Greece, they've started barter systems to get around their problems. So there are a lot of grassroots movements, but we need an international solution. And the only route to that international solution is Occupy. There is no other means to do it. All of the people who are sitting in power, they don't understand that there's no salvation in the current economic paradigm. They haven't the imagination to understand it. I talk to qualified economists, and they just don't get it. Half of them don't even know that banks create money out of nothing. And yet this is an open secret. John Maynard Keynes said, the process by which banks create money is so simple, it repels the mind. The chairman of Midland Bank to shareholders in 1924 openly admitted that banks create money from nothing, and that gave them the power to control everything. And don't forget Ansel Rothschild about the power to issue and control money. This is where the power lies, not in Westminster. Westminster has no power. The US Senate is bought by banks. Obama was bought by banks.
I'm just wondering where you come from. And I'm always fascinated because I see her picture on every single piece of money in this country. And I noticed that she's also the head of the church up the road. So where does she come into it in terms of how does she influence the way money is used in this country and how the banking system operates?
I think she's an accidental beneficiary of a very large amount of money and land. I don't think she's part of the process necessarily. What is far more important, and I see, what's your name? Michael has that book. That is another book you should read, because what I've told you is only half the story, because there's a huge amount of money which is sitting in offshore banking centres. And the biggest offshore banking centre sits just the other side of Ludgate Circus. It is a nation state in itself. The Queen has to ask permission to go in there. Their laws are governed internally. She has to ask permission. When William the Conqueror came to Britain and invaded in 1066, he had to negotiate with the banks in the square mile. That is a state within a state.
I thought they actually got freedom of the city if you were a queen. Got freedom of the city.
Yeah, everywhere except the City of London. It's a state within a state, as is Washington.
I kind of wanted to come back to what you said about the banks having the power and the Westminster not having the power, because for me that is kind of the whole key in the issue, both when it comes to speaking about banks creating money. Kind of my main problem with that is such a huge power being in private hands instead of public hands that don't have any kind of accountability. and that is kind of, in my mind, that is very much tied to the euro crisis and what you explained about former Goldman Sachs people basically being in every Southern European government. I think the Spanish, whatever this,
finance minister.
Yeah,
He could. I don't know. In fact, I was looking at this article and it didn't mention Spain. But suffice to say, Goldman are very good at politicking.
No, because the whole thing is that I can see that as an intentional process to kind of penetrate every government, so that essentially the interest of the Southern European states becomes the interest of Goldman Sachs. Like, if you kind of know what I mean, like where Greece or Italian policies are, at least like I follow the Finnish media somewhat because I'm from Finland, and I guess the German media, especially like these kind of winners out in the Euro crisis countries, the media really portray Southern European policies really good if they are good in the minds of investors. Like, you know,
well, this
we
is the
have
whole
all
thing.
these like technocratic governments which can implement changes that democratic governments could never do because they be accountable to the people and people just like rise up against them. But when they have kind of less accountability, they can suddenly do whatever they want, and obviously they do things that are in the interest of
Investors.
yeah,
So
exactly.
do- so
For
do-
example, Goldman Sachs.
So the elected governments do in the interest.
Yeah,
I mean, Goldman Sachs, the former employee of Goldman Sachs, is the finance minister of Greece. He's the guy that's just been put in charge, the technocrat in charge of Italy used to work for Goldman Sachs, and Obama's chief staff is from Goldman Sachs. So it can happen supposedly in the best democracy in the world as well. It's about where power lies.
Can I just before I take that, I just want to say something. There is another book I would recommend. I'm good at giving out references to books. It's a book by Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine. Shock Doctrine. Now you talked about needing, would they be able to implement these policies in a democracy? Well, a lot of these policies came out of the Chicago Business School, and it was done throughout South America, and most graphically in Chile, where it could only be imposed with military repression and death squads and all the rest of it. And it was replicated in South Africa, it was replicated in Poland, it is replicated everywhere. So it's well worth reading Naomi Klein. Sorry, you.
Yeah.
I didn't get your name.
Mel.
Mel.
I think the whole thing is inextricably linked. So I mean, you talked about private interests and not having it being out of the public domain, but politicians are non-exec directors of these banks. So it's just the people, as you say, like there's a very narrow band of people, companies that control people and companies. Obviously, people. There's one person or a couple of people that are directing mind of the company. So yeah, it's all very, very intricately linked, and it's this whole like fucking axis of evil. We have to break that. And it's not. I don't think. So my point to you. I mean, I agree with everything you say, but it's I mean, Westminster is part of it. Really heavily involved in it as well.
I think the other thing to bear in mind is what we haven't talked about is war. In this critical thinking course, we're doing 4 modules this year. The first module is banking and the monetary system. The second module is the subprime crisis, which we've more or less finished, but we're still continuing with the banking and finance module sort of in parallel. We're just starting wars in the 21st century. Now, what we're analysing is the link between the banking system and wars. Because one of the things that the banking system underpins is the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex, I don't know if you're aware, but most of America is now, its military force is not just what you see visibly in its defense budget, but a lot of America's military might has been privatized. Companies like Blackwater. There's a huge private military mercenary army which is deployed on behalf of America around the globe. And the thing about the military-industrial complex is it needs perpetual war. It has to have a reason to exist. And the most damning of all of the indictments I would lay at the door of the banking and monetary system is that it supports an economic growth, an economic system which demands exponential growth. And you know, you've seen, are we tipping into recession? Are we going to get back to growth? America's just achieved 2%. You know, everybody talks about growth. Now, in nature, organisms grow very fast at first, and they get to a certain level, and then they level out. I became a grandfather a year ago, and these kids shoot up, and they get to about 20, and they level off, and then we as human beings, we grow qualitatively. There are things that grow exponentially in nature, viruses and disease, and that is what our economic growth system is, and our banking system is. It's an exponential system that is a cancer at the heart of our civilization. And if we want to achieve sustainability, there's no point in pioneering green policies and all the rest of it. We need to attack the root of the problem, which is the banking system which drives the economic system that we live under. And that's the way we will achieve sustainability. And it will change people's mindsets about the way they think about each other. The idea, you know, in the Renaissance period, farmers would work 14 weeks a year. They would spend the rest of the time learning, enjoying themselves. They had time to develop as human beings. There wasn't this yoke of having to pay off the debt and therefore having to do a 40, a 50, a 60, 70-hour week that we live under today. We live under a form of slavery. Slavery was abolished 200 years ago, but it's been reinvented in the current form. I mean, leaving aside, you know, human trafficking and all the other things. But debt slavery is a huge problem.
So one other sort of stance on that. You know, I'm interested in the complicity of the legal system in all this, and companies have been obliged for a long time legally obliged to maximise profit for the shareholders. And you know, what do you think about that? I mean, I think that's also a cancer at the heart of our civilization, or this civilization.
Yeah,
anyway.
it is a product. I mean, one of the problems we have when I came into the city, we had fairly effective monopolies and mergers and takeover panels to look at all takeovers in the public interest. We've just had a banking crisis of banks too big to fail. What was the remedy? To ram them together to create even bigger banks. We have retailers that dominate the food market. You know, the problem is everything is too big, and that's supported by the banking system because companies are encouraged to leverage up their balance sheet. And all of these bankers have to have a reason to exist. So putting together mergers and acquisitions is all part of the process. But if you change the monetary base, I mean, one of the other fundamental changes in America is that corporations are given the same rights as people. Crazy idea. Even more in America. They have even more rights in America than
corporations have human rights.
And it is ludicrous.
Yeah.
Basically, corporations are a tool to be used. In fact, one of the big changes since I've been in the city is, apart from lawyers, stockbrokers, stock jobbers, accountants, they were all partnerships. And that meant that if they did something wrong, they could lose their houses, their homes, everything they had. And that kept them honest. Once they were allowed to become incorporated as limited liability companies, all bets were off. Some of the biggest crooks in all this are the accountants and the lawyers and all the rest of them who helped set up these offshore havens. You know, I know these people. They're nice people. You know, they don't think they're evil people. I spend time with them. You know, they're not evil people, but they live within a system that allows them to do very bad things in the long term. They don't see it as being bad, but we are reaping the consequences of what we built. And at the risk of repeating myself, we have to go back to the banking system to sort it out. Have I exhausted you all? It is hell of a lot. It's taken me a long time, and I work in the system. I used to manage money. I was never a banker. I've been described as an ex-banker. I was never a banker. Not that that would bother me if I had been, but it's just a matter of fact. I used to manage money. I've run a stockbroking firm. I currently have a small firm which markets mutual funds to professional investors, so not dealing with the general public. It's a form of prostitution, but we've all got to make a living. It's a form of prostitution. If I could survive doing this, I would do this. But I have obligations, family, and things to do. So.
All right. Does anyone have any more questions? Because otherwise, I'm going to move on to next part of the agenda, which is my proposal.
What do you think about